Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ettore Greco. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Institute of International Affairs in Rome, where I had the program on multilateralism and global governance, which also includes a line of research on arms control and disarmament. Many thanks for accepting our invitation for being with us today. This seminar on opportunities, threats, and proliferation challenges deriving from biotechnology and bioengineering. This seminar is organized by our institute jointly with the Vienna Center for Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, and takes place in the framework of an initiative, a program called the Young Women and Next Generation Initiative, which includes essentially two elements: a next generation dimension. We organize an annual next generation workshop every year when young experts have the opportunity to discuss various topical non-proliferation and disarmament problems, including regional ones. And the program also includes a mentorship program for young women interested in learning more about the field of arms control, non-proliferation, and disarmament. This year, as we did last year, we have launched this new cycle of this mentorship program, and we have this year 20 mentees born from Europe and outside Europe. They are taking part in this mentorship program after having been chosen through a selection process, which is open not only to those who are already familiar with disarmament and non-proliferation issues, but also those who want to better understand some basic problems associated with arms control, and also the opportunities to develop a career in the field. Let me also mention that this initiative, the Young Women and Next Generation Initiative, is part of a wider project funded by the European Commission, the Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Network. This is the title of this program. This network is composed of more than 100 think tanks, study centers, also university. It is coordinated by a consortium of 6 institutes, including my institute and the Vienna Center. The overall goal of the project is to discuss and help improve the EU strategy and policies in the field of non-proliferation and disarmament. So it has both a scientific and policy-oriented dimension. Today's seminar is, of course, public. It is open to all interested people, and it will be recorded. But particularly, I would say, as students, young specialists who want to learn more, they also acquire a deeper knowledge about arms control, non-proliferation, and disarmament. In previous seminars during this, as part of these initiatives, we addressed various issues, including, for instance, nuclear proliferation and the future of the nuclear order and chemical disarmament. Today's seminar, as I said, is specifically devoted to the biological dimension of arms control and disarmament, which we want to discuss from various perspectives, possibly focusing not only on the state of play of the arms control agreements and initiatives, particularly the role of the Biological Weapons Convention, that is the most important instrument we have in this section of the arms control and disarmament. And also, we would like to discuss the results of the last review conference of the convention, but also considering latest developments in biotechnology and bioengineering, and what they imply in the terms of opportunities and risk, and all issues associated with the efforts to possibly improve the existing regime and introducing new measures to ensure the biological disarmament holds. As in the previous seminars, the panelists will also provide information and advice about the, as I said, the career opportunities, which is a key component of our program in the field of biological non-proliferation and disarmament, particularly opportunity that can be offered by international organizations, but also think tanks and study centers. And indeed, we have with us, I must say, today a very qualified panel. Angela Kane, former UN High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, who is also a senior fellow at the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. Filippa Lentzos, Associate Professor in Science and International Security at King's College in London. And James Revill, head of the Weapons of Mass Destruction and Space Security Programs at UNIDIR. I wish to thank them for accepting our invitation, and again, all of you for taking part in the seminar. And very much look forward to debate today. And now, without further ado, I have the pleasure to give the floor to my colleague Federica Dall'Arche, who will chair the panel and also give you further information about today's program. Federica, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ettore, and hello everyone. Hello and welcome also on my side. My name is Federica Dall'Arche. I'm a senior research associate at the VCDNP, and I have the honor and the pleasure to moderate the discussion today with our very high-level panel. Ettore has already introduced our amazing speakers. I just would like to add an affiliation for one of our speakers, Dr. Angela Kane, who is also a senior advisor at the Nuclear Threat Initiative. So our speakers today will speak about the challenges and risks associated with biological agents, as Ettore has mentioned, but we'll also look at the rapid advances in biotechnologies. And at the end of the conversation, we will also focus on career opportunities in this field and how, what suggestion we can give to the next generation or the young professionals to enter the biological non-proliferation and disarmament workforce. So in the second part of the event, we will open the floor for questions from the audience. So I hope that the first part will spur some will provide you with some interesting food for thought. So please, to the audience, please feel free to use the Q&A function that you see at the bottom. I know after 3 years of using Zoom, I'm sure you're very familiar with the function, but if you're not, if you click on more, you will find Q&A, and then if you click on there, you can type your questions, and I will be happy to read them for you. So without further ado, Angela, I will start with you. As I didn't mention this, but we would like this to be a very interactive conversation rather than delivering presentations. So I will organize this discussion asking questions to our speakers. And Angela, if you agree, I would start with you. Can you tell us why do we need to pay attention to biological agents from an uncontrolled non-proliferation and disarmament point of view? And what are the risks that are associated with biological agents, and how are they evolving?
Thank you, Ettore, and thank you, Federica. And I'm very happy to be here with my co-panelists who are going to discuss bioweapons or bio initiatives. And I want to just say welcome also to these young women, and you know that's aimed at them to be here, because sometimes it's very forbidding. If you're not a scientist, do you really want to enter into this? And I just want to assure you that I'm not a scientist, and I'm working right now in bioscience at the Nuclear Threat Initiative. But on the other hand, you can also look at it in terms of the governance weapons, and I think Ettore already spoke about this. I mean, there's a larger landscape that we're facing here. But when it comes to biological agents, what is really important is to keep in mind how quickly the field has developed. We just didn't think about this, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. And what we've seen is that the rapid bioscience and also the biotechnology advances that have occurred in the last couple of years have absolutely wonderful potential benefits. And that's really to the benefit of people, to the benefit of mankind. But at the same time, it's a dual use. And so it can also be basically used for nefarious purposes, and it can be used for attacks. And when you have an outbreak somewhere, if it is limited or if it is a larger one, you just don't know where it's coming from. And when you think about the outbreaks that we've faced, and that is like from, H1N1, the swine flu, we have the COVID pandemic. What really shows is that the world is very ill prepared to deal with these challenges. And that means that if there is an outbreak that is maybe caused in a malicious intent, then how do you actually deal with that? And that's something that we have to be guarding against. And when you think about the Biological Weapons Convention, which we'll be talking about in a little bit, you know that it's one of the oldest. I mean, you have the nuclear weapons, the non-proliferation treaty, but it didn't outlaw nuclear weapons, but biological weapons were actually outlawed. And we've been fortunate in many ways because we haven't really had a lot of biological weapons used that we had to actually deal with. So this is something that we always need to keep in mind. It's a possibility. It is a very possible occurrence, could happen, but we just don't know. And we also, and that's the last point I want to make on this, we also have to be mindful of the fact that it can be used in a statement sense. And I'm thinking here particularly of the Russian accusations against Ukrainian biolabs that it was developing biological weapons. I mean, it is very clear that that was not happening. But on the other hand, you can possibly use that as an accusation, as a false flag operation, where it could be used for the pretext of having a biological attack launched later on. So we basically need to deal with this issue, where on the one hand, it's beneficial, biotechnology, it's a wonderful science, it's a wonderful tool that we have. But on the other hand, it also has the bad part of it, where it could be misused for other purposes that could very much harm populations, people, everything. Back to you, Federica.
Thanks so much, Angela. Thanks so much for raising so many interesting points already. The dual potentiality of these agents is definitely on top of our conversation today. But you mentioned outbreaks, and that takes me to the second part, or the second question that I wanted to ask you. I know you've spent the last months with MTI working on a proposal to establish international mechanism to investigate origins of bioevents. So how can we know whether a biological event has occurred naturally, or if it is, how can we know if it's a result of manipulated, misused, weaponized biological agents? Are there specific signs that this international mechanism can look into?
Well, that the mechanism is an interesting development that basically came out of pre-COVID. I mean, it was put on the table pre-COVID, and we weren't quite sure how to deal with it, where to place it. But on the other hand, what happens is that you have when you had COVID-19 declared, it took a couple of months for the World Health Organization, because of course it was an occurrence that happened, to put together a team that went out. And I think to this day there's still a little bit of a doubt as to how it actually happened. And no one thought at the time that it would be a bioweapon. But when it comes to a bioweapon, let's put it this way. You have actually the Biological Weapons Convention, where you have a mechanism where you could go to the Security Council if you're suspecting that that's what had happened. That did not occur. You also have a mechanism that was established in the follow-up after the Iran-Iraq chemical weapons attacks, where the Security Council and the member states and the General Assembly developed a mechanism. It's called the Secretary General's mechanism to investigate particularly malicious attacks, like a bioweapon or a chemical weapon. That's only been used so far 3 times, 40 years ago in in Azerbaijan and Mozambique, with no results at all. And then in Syria in 2015, which was an investigation in chemical weapons, which I had led, where it was definitely determined that, yes, sarin was used, chemical weapon was used. But those were the 3 instances that we have. but also that mechanism can be used to investigate biological weapons. And it's never been used for that. First of all, it's very, very hard to prove that it was a malicious attack. And so when you have an outbreak somewhere, and this is where the initiative for what we call the joint assessment mechanism comes in. When you have an outbreak somewhere, how do you know if it's natural, which would be for the WHO, or whether it's malicious, in which case someone would have to raise the flag, so to say, we need this investigated, and then you use it and basically declare it as a malicious attack. But if there is an outbreak and you don't know what it is it natural or is it malicious, then where do you go? You don't have a mechanism. So what we had outlined and what we had developed was an initiative which would be a very small mechanism in the Office of the Secretary General. And that would be like 5-6 people who would have ahead of it a small unit that basically, if there is something that is looking a little bit odd, let's say that it's not natural, or maybe it's natural, but you don't know what it is, to basically look into this and sort of say, let's discern what it is, let's analyze what it is. And then basically, because the information that would come from the Secretary General through this office, it actually would be trusted. Because right now there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation going around. And that's something that we really wanted to also counter, to so say. And what would happen is, because if it's in the Secretary General's office, he can sort of say to the capacities that are developed already under the Secretary General's mechanism, which are member states' capacities, there's been training for that. He could use those. He could use the labs that are also affiliated with that. He could use the labs that are affiliated with the World Health Organization, because it's all under one hat, because the Secretary General is like the head, person in this, the executive officer in this case. And, he would have the flexibility to deploy that. So that's why it would be a small notion. And let me also be very frank. We know what's going on right now with member states and the Security Council and the disagreements in the Security Council. So having it in the Office of the Secretary General shields it from any political influence. It's basically up to the Secretary General to deploy that mechanism, or to deploy a team as he sees fit. And I think that adds a great deal to the independence of the assessment as well.
Thank you, Angela. And what are the chances for this mechanism to be actually implemented? Should it be implemented soon? Is there any timeline? And since I'm also asking questions already, what is the link with the Biological Weapons Convention, and what is the role of the Biological Weapons Convention in countering the spread of biological agents?
Well, when you sort of say, should it be implemented soon? We also look very closely at the report that the Secretary General issued in 2021, which is called Our Common Agenda. And if you read that report, which is about 45 pages or so, you find that about a good over half of it, I think, is on pandemic preparedness. He talks a lot about preparing for the future. And because that was in the midst of the COVID pandemic that the report came out, there is a lot of thinking and a lot of proposals also about what could come out of the pandemic and how could we kind of build back better. And he talks a lot about we need to deal with the challenges that we have. And this is one of the challenges. So we think this very much fits into the Secretary General's COVID, or let's say pandemic preparedness or pandemic countering the efforts. And he also wanted to put together and propose this, a scientific advisory board that used to exist. It got dissolved. But again, it's something like the scientific advisory board could also get involved in this, because I'm sure that there are specialists of all kinds of varieties of science involved in it. And so that's another possibility where he could have it. And that would actually be very helpful. When would he do it? I think that what we would need, and this is something that we've been working in, that I've been working in particularly, is to also not only make member states aware of it, but make member states supportive of this proposal. And the other avenue where we have basically started to talk to is there is a so-called high-level advisory board on effective multilateralism. And this high-level advisory board is an independent board composed of high-ranking officials or former officials like prime ministers, foreign ministers, etc. It is headed by the former prime minister of Sweden and the former president of Liberia. They're the co-chairs of this, and they are looking at a number of proposals that have come out of their consultations that they've had. I've spoken to them twice, and maybe they will take this on board. I don't know, but they will be actually making proposals to the Secretary General focused on our common agenda and the proposals that could be implemented. That would be very important if that was the case. And then it's basically up to the Secretary General to say, yes, I'm susceptible. I'm looking at this proposal very seriously. I'd like to make it happen. And I'm sure he'll also turn to member states to say, can you support that? And we have heard in our consultations that there is a lot of support. I mean, we've also worked with working groups, and Jamie Revill, I will be frank here, has also kind of helped us. We've reached out to a lot of people already to sort of say, what do you think? How can we make it better? How should we go about it? And so that's basically where this all stands. And now I'm sorry, I've forgotten the last part of your question that you asked.
Oh, no, this is so interesting, actually, that I would love to hear more about the mechanism, actually, and the effort to put it into place. But the second part of the question was the relation with the Biological Weapons Convention.
Right. Yeah. Well, again, the biological weapons is exactly that, weapons. I mean, we're not necessarily dealing with weapons because that is well covered. And I think what we have seen is that the Biological Weapons Convention, and I'm the first one to sort of say it really should be supported more strongly. It really is a very small, it's called an implementation support unit. So it isn't really buttressed and supported by scientists who can actually do a lot of, analysis or whatever that you would need. So I think that while the member states, who are after all paying for this, are reluctant, and we've seen over the years, and this convention has been in force now for 50 years, so there hasn't really been the support that one would have liked to see for it. So you have to find other ways of doing it. If you can't get it through one way, then you can get it through another way. But I have always maintained, and this also comes back to my long years in the United Nations, that I don't want to undermine the United Nations at all. I want to support it. But I also find that if there is something that you can't get it done in one particular office or in one particular entity, then you're going to have to find other ways of doing it and to do it cooperatively. So, that's basically where we come in and where the relationship with the Biological Weapons Convention comes in, because the Biological Weapons Convention, as I said, is very limited in what it wants to do, precisely because the member states want to keep it that way. If they had wanted to do something else, I think that would have been very possible, but there's no unity. And I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit later with either Jamie or Filippa on the outcome of it. And I think that we also would all like to see it as a much stronger organization than it currently is, meaning the ISU.
Thank you, Angela. This is a very good point. For the OPCW, we have an organization. For the Biological Weapons Convention, we have an implementation supporting unit, as you mentioned. But thanks so much for contributing. And so, Filippa, I'm going to turn to you. I know you've attended the RevCon, the 9th RevCon of the BWC, who was just concluded in December 2022. The United Nations Secretary General defined it as a glimmer of hope in an overall bleak international security environment. So my question to you is, what are the BWC main accomplishments so far? What are its shortcomings? And what came out from the latest review conference? Were new mechanisms being discussed at least or implemented to strengthen the convention?
Thanks, Federica, and hello, everyone. It's great to have you with us. Thanks for starting us off on some positives, Federica. I think that's useful in this field. So, as Angela mentioned, one of the accomplishments really of the BWC is that, unlike the nuclear field, we've already got a ban in place in the biological field. And we've had that for a really long time, as Angela was saying, nearly 50 years. So the prohibition and the repugnance to the deliberate use of biology to cause harm is ingrained in both a normative and legal framework. So that's a major plus. Another real positive is that the ban is comprehensive. So the BWC comprehensively covers harm with all kinds of pathogens, whether they're naturally occurring or genetically modified, or whether you strip them down to solely their active components. So the treaty is comprehensive. And another positive is that the treaty is future-proof. So the text of the treaty is very short, very general, but more importantly, it's focused on the general purpose criterion, which means that it doesn't matter what scientific and technological advances we have. What matters is intent. So whether you intend to use biology and the life science for good or bad, essentially. So, and if you're using biology for good, that's fine. If you're intending to use biology for bad, that's not good, right? That's what's prohibited by the BWC. So the diplomats back in the late 60s, early 70s kind of managed to negotiate a pretty cool document, a pretty lasting and sustainable treaty. And of course, as Angela also said, the biggest plus of all, biological weapons have not been used in war since the BWC came into force. So we should try to keep this kind of bigger positive picture at the back of our minds during these discussions, because the biological field and the BWC, biological disarmament, faces many, many challenges. And it's often easy to kind of get lost in those challenges rather than focusing also on this bigger positive picture. So main outcomes of the 9th Review Conference, I think I would characterize them as modest, but they were better than expected. Now, our expectations were extremely low. So we did get something, but obviously it wasn't what, we would have got in an ideal world. So what we did get was a new intersessional program. So these review conferences happen every 5 years. And so between these review conferences are meetings coming together to discuss and hopefully develop mutual understandings of how, you see the situation, you see the threats, you see the opportunities, you see how to respond to these things, and then hopefully develop these kind of mutual understandings. So we've got a new program of work. It's one working group. It's slightly different to what we've had in the last few years. It's got a mandate. It's got a very broad mandate, basically, to talk about how do we strengthen the convention. It's covering things like cooperation and assistance, developments in science and technology, confidence building measures, transparency, compliance, possibly even verification seems to be on the table, etc. In addition, the ISU gets one new person. So that's up from 3. So they will then be a total of 4 people in the implementation support unit, which is, as was already mentioned, not an organization. It's not there as, it's really there as an administrative unit to support the development of these meetings, or the preparation and running and reporting of these meetings. So what we got was an agreement to keep talking, which at this point is good. There were also some really important things that we didn't get. Most importantly, there was no final declaration. There's no final article by article review. So there was no acceptable language that could be found to address some of the things that have happened in the last year. And many of you may well be aware of the Russian allegations against or claiming that the US is developing biological weapons in the Ukraine. There's been a special meeting in the BWC on this. There's been a special meeting in the Security Council on this under specific BWC articles. So one under the Article 5, one under Article 6. And there was no way in which states were going to agree on the sort of language to describe these meetings. And so because of that, we had to sacrifice the entire, article by article review part of the final document. So I think that was a big blow. There were also many other very concrete proposals on the table that had support of many states, including a scientific advisory board, and those sorts of things that were again simply sacrificed in order to get to this new intersessional process. New mechanism. Federica, just finally, you asked about new mechanisms to strengthen the convention. Are there any? No, there's nothing formal agreed. We're still talking about strengthening the convention, not actually doing anything collectively.
Thank you for bringing us back to reality, Filippa. But obviously, the review conferences are negotiated by the diplomatic community more than the scientific one. So I guess it's a bit of inevitable that the process gets politicized. Do you think there is a gap between the scientific community and the diplomatic community that actually negatively impact this process, this negotiation process? If there were more, if the involvement of the scientific community was greater, do you think things would have been different? Is there any plan on involving the scientific community in the working group that you've mentioned that was just established? And how can we reduce this gap?
Well, I think we should acknowledge that first and foremost, the BWC is the purview of diplomats to a large extent, right? This is a treaty between states, and they have formal representatives that negotiate and come to agreement. But and traditionally, I should say, there has been very little involvement of any other stakeholders other than states. But in the last decade or two, you see, we've been in this field a long time. We think that's sort of recent. There has been more inclusion of stakeholders, including scientists, especially more recently, early career scientists, which is wonderful. And there have been, efforts to try to include more scientists in the discussions. Now, that doesn't mean there's actually a seat at the decision-making table for other stakeholders or than state representatives. And I think that's a real loss. And I don't think that's really in step with contemporary disarmament policy, where NGOs or non-governments tend to play a more active role in the formal discussions. But there is more engagement by the scientific community on questions of biosafety and biosecurity outside of the treaty. And, just to very briefly mention a couple of examples, one of which is the landmark WHO guidance document on biorisk management that was published 2-3 months ago, and that both Jamie and I were involved in developing. That's really sets up a sort of framework for what do we think of today is considered responsible science, and what does that mean in terms of biosafety and security, and what does that mean for not just governments, but what does it mean for scientists and their research institutions and their funders and their publishers and the private sector and all of these different stakeholders. Another initiative is an international task force that's been set up by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which is, aiming to consider trends and oversight of high-risk pathogen research. And we're seeing increasingly more high-risk biological research going on. And the question is, well, are there some red lines there? Are there things that we think actually should just never be investigated? Or what are the sorts of risk assessments that we need to see put in place in order for us to feel that this is being done safely, securely, and responsibly. So those are two, concrete examples of initiatives that could potentially reduce the gap that you were talking about, Federica, between the scientific and diplomatic communities. And there are, of course, many, many other valuable initiatives, some of which we might get to later.
Thank you, Filippa. Thank you also for mentioning the high-risk bio research and developments in biotechnology. This is actually something that I think would be very interesting to dig a little bit more in. But before we go into that with James, do all these developments in biotechnology and, as you mentioned, the high-risk biological research, did they play a role or did they affect at all the review process? Were they mentioned during the negotiations?
Sure. I mean, the developments in the field have been a central concern within the treaty and members of the treaty for a long time. The BWC, as I already mentioned, has proved as a treaty has proved remarkably durable. So cutting edge developments in genome editing and synthetic biology, next generation biotechnology, all these buzzwords that we hear about today, they are in fact, they continue to be covered by the treaty because it's so deliberately broad in scope. But the mechanisms to update the BWC, so I think that part is actually still very good. It's all covered under the BWC, but the mechanisms to update the BWC, the mechanisms to get those additional understandings on the record formally, those are no longer fit for purpose. And that means that it's difficult, often impossible, to get states to agree on these new understandings about how developments in science and technology affect the BWC and international security. So just, very briefly, some examples of what I mean when I say the BWC mechanisms aren't fit for purpose. So the BWC members review the treaty every 5 years. Now, given the scale and the speed and the urgency of emerging biological threats, this 5-year cycle is simply too long. BWC members need to make decisions on strengthening the treaty on a much more regular basis. We saw attempts to give annual meetings decision-making powers at the review conference that we just talked about, but that didn't fly, and it looks like it's not likely to fly. But even if there was decision-making power, even if the review conferences were happening more frequently, BWC member states still have to reach consensus on all decisions that are taken at review conferences. And I think this consensus, which, is a sacred mantra within the international community, is actually hampering a lot of progress in the BWC. It is allowing spoiler states to spoil the outcomes of these meetings that take an awful lot of time to prepare for, cost money to run, expend a lot of energies, etc. And my view is really that the international community should be trying to supplement traditional multilateralism, which is very much based in the last century, the mechanisms of it, with a more mini-lateralist approach. And Angela already talked about finding other ways of doing things and doing so cooperatively. And I would absolutely support that. I think going at the problem with a more mini-lateralist approach, bringing together a smaller number of countries that have the greatest impact on an issue can be an effective way, not to displace the BWC. The BWC is the foundation, but to enable it to move forward, right, is really to bring together some of these smaller states, initiatives, with also other stakeholders to set up good examples. And there are good examples of this. There are good examples of coalitions of the willing when it comes to global biorisk management. And one of these is around, global health security agenda. Another is around the global partnership and its biosecurity working groups. They're doing an awful lot of good, especially through their Africa Signature Initiative. There's what's called the International Experts Group of Biosafety, Biosecurity Regulators. There's Biosafety Level 4 Zoonotic Lab Network. There's all kinds of other groupings that consist of different constellations of states and non-state actors that I think can also provide really fruitful outcomes when it comes to biorisk management. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Filippa. Thank you very, very much for shedding a light on procedural matters at this point that prevent a step forward, I would say. But we talked about genome editing, biological agents, bioengineer, artificial intelligence also comes to my mind. And the mix of these words really sounds dangerous, scary, and promising too at the same time. Angela at the very beginning mentioned that advances in biotechnologies can actually have enormous benefits if they are used for peaceful purposes, but they also raise safety, security, legal, and even ethical concerns, if you will, and if they are misused. So, James, I'm going to you now. Can you tell us a little bit about this connection, about the connection between all these words and artificial intelligence, genome editing, developments in biotechnologies, and how this connection can create, on one hand, positive opportunities, and maybe we can go to the negative ones a little bit later in the discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Federica, and thank you to the organisers for the chance to be able to join this eminent panel. I think that you said it's scary. I think it is scary. I think it's quite important to be upfront about that, because what we're seeing at the moment is the advance, the convergence and the diffusion of life sciences and biotechnology. And I think it's happening at a pace which is far quicker than the 5-yearly timeframe that Filippa mentioned. I'd agree with much of what Filippa said. And this will have potentially significant implications for biological disarmament, but also much more generally in terms of public health, in terms of energy security, and a number of other sort of mega trends that we're facing. And I think looking at those opportunities is actually really important, because I think sometimes in the security community, we tend to focus on threats and risks. So I think framing it with the positives first is quite useful. And indeed, there are a range of positives that emerge from the convergence of biotechnology and AI. I think particularly when you look at this in terms of being in combination with growth in computational power and the growth of data sets, including publicly available data sets on things like biologically active chemicals on the genome, the proteomics, the transcriptomics of these different cells, the sort of components of life. And I think this is opening up a number of new possibilities. One obvious area where this appears is in relation to drug development. The use of machine learning algorithms can be really quite powerful in screening chemical compounds to identify new or novel chemicals that potentially have promising activities against a particular disease target. I think it's also useful in looking at existing drugs and how they could be repurposed to things that are already approved and how they could be used to deal with new or emerging diseases as well. And I think here you can see AI could play a really important role in helping inform predictions about potential drug candidates and sort of facilitating that testing process, the clinical trial process as well. It's not going to solve all the challenges, and I think there are a number of areas where you still need that human agency involved, but I think it can save money. It can cut out some of those laborious processes around screening, so I think there's a real role there. More generally, I think there's potential role in terms of this feeding into understanding both the toxicity of particular compounds and the drug interactions that you might find in drug candidates as well. And I think, Filippa, this is something you've written on quite a bit on in various articles. Other areas, I think you could see how AI and biotechnology could be quite useful in the future in identifying personalized medicine treatment plans for patients using their genetic and medical data to try and map out most suitable, most effective therapies. And then when you look more closely at biological disarmament, you could see how potentially AI, biotechnology could play a role in augmenting bioforensics, or even getting it to try and build confidence in compliance or work around verification. So I think there's folks at CNS have looked at the potential utility of machine learning algorithms to classify relevant images of dual-use goods. And this could potentially serve as a tool for detecting violations of strategic trade controls. You could also see how this could be used in satellite imagery analysis. So is there potential to identify characteristics of a facility? I say that, but I'm also very conscious that I'm not actually sure we know what a biological weapons facility would theoretically look like now, because the last time we had these discussions really is about 30 years ago. So I don't think there's a clear idea of what a biological weapon or indeed a biological weapons program would look like now. One point I think that's also useful to think about, and this is not just looking at the advance and the convergence of these different technologies, but also looking at agency. And I think here there is a significant change in the landscape of life science research over the last 2 decades or so. So particularly since the collapse of the protocol, really, and we now have orders of magnitude more publications, more institutions, more patents, which are associated with biotechnology. And this is a fundamentally good thing, but it does create real challenges in managing this increasingly complex converging sets of technologies. And it's almost compounded by the fact that you have new means and new approaches to doing biological research through the DIY bio movement and groups like that. Again, it's fundamentally a good thing, but it does really complicate the problem of managing dual-use biotechnology. And I'd also, just to follow up on Filippa's point, I think it really does require that sort of engagement with stakeholders, but also with industry actors in particular, who I think have long been missing from some of these discussions. And I'll stop there, but I'm happy to follow up as you see fit, Federica.
Thank you, James. And actually, this is a good way to go into the negative sides of these technological developments. What are the kind of technological developments that are taking place and that might pose a threat if they're not properly controlled? Can you give us, you mentioned this already a little bit, but can you give us some concrete examples, so maybe the audience that is not super familiar with these issues can understand properly?
Yeah, I think here you have a range of possible ways through which you could fundamentally change what we understand and what we mean by biological weapons. I mean, genome editing tools, CRISPR-Cas tends to get a lot of attention. It's become almost emblematic of dual-use biotechnology now. But there are a range of other tools that I think as well. And to come back to the AI one, I think there's a really interesting example. Again, this is something that Filippa has written on with Sean Ekins from Collaborations Pharmaceuticals. And that's about kind of using AI tools. And this is actually based on a case study. So perhaps I'll start talking a little bit about that. When somebody from Collaborations Pharmaceuticals was invited to present at Spiez's Convergence conference on the potential dual-use implications of advances in AI, they actually went about and used their machine learning models to design molecules with desired bioactivity or toxicity molecules, really to test to see what they could come up with in terms of new chemical warfare agents. Now, to be very clear and avoid getting any sort of lawsuit or anything, the Spiez Convergence conference is not about creating biological or chemical weapons. It's about understanding trends in science and technology with a view to strengthening the wider regime and strengthening chemical and biological weapons convention. Nonetheless, as part of the preparations for this event, Sean and his colleagues went and sort of did this testing, used their machine learning technology to see what they could identify. In about 6 hours, they were able to rapidly generate about 40,000 virtual molecules with minimal computational resources. Some of these molecules were highly lethal and included VX, but also VX analogs as well. And in effect, they demonstrated the capacity of artificial intelligence to design virtual nerve agents. Now, this is kind of orientated to chemistry, but the same approach could theoretically be used, could be applied to develop novel biologics as well, including potential biological weapons agents. So you could see how some of these tools, although there's a clear peaceful purpose, if you repurpose them, then there is really quite some scope for potentially causing harm. At the same time, I do think it's important to have a little bit of grounds for optimism, but also a note of caution, because what is theoretically possible with technology is not necessarily always going to be easy and something that every actor can undertake. And I think there are still some significant tacit knowledge barriers to the weaponization of biology in a significant manner. I think there are still some challenges there, just so people can hopefully sleep a little bit better tonight. I'll stop there, but I'm happy to follow up with other questions as well.
Well, thanks so much for ending on almost positive note, saying that there are actually barriers, and so it's not as scary as it sounds, but it is definitely something that we should definitely pay more attention. But let's shift gears a little bit to end this conversation on a positive note. As Ettore mentioned at the very beginning, this event is organized under the Young Women Next Generation Initiative. The purpose of these type of events is to involve the younger generation, young professionals in entering the field. So I have a question for the three of you. What are the suggestions that you would give younger people, younger professional students that are undertaking their studies to enter the field? What was your path, for instance? Angela mentioned at the very beginning she's not a scientist, yet she's working on bioscience right now. So how did you end up here? What recommendation would you give? What type of studies would you suggest people to undertake? So I think it would be beneficial to go in the same order as we went. So Angela first, Filippa and Jamie. So Angela, the floor is yours.
Well, I must say that when I started out my career, women in STEM was really not an issue that was discussed. There were very few of the women in STEM, and I certainly wasn't one of them. I studied political science and economics. But I believe that if you really wanted to go into bioscience, biotechnology, or even weapons technology in terms of bio, you have to have the scientific background. It's very hard. I mean, I come from a governance background, and that's my forte, and that's what I'm working on. But I'm working with people who are primarily science-oriented. So I have benefited from that by learning an awful lot. But on the other hand, I am still not a fully fledged scientist, and I have to ask questions now and then. So if that's what you really want to do, then, by all means, go into that. But I must also say, and what Filippa said was very, very true in terms of, biological weapons, whether it's the convention or whether it's other conventions, they are being discussed by member states and member states diplomats. And they're not necessarily, very rarely, in fact, do they have the scientific background. So they're looking at this from a government policy background, but not necessarily from a science background. So, these are the two avenues that you can really go. But I find that if you are engaged in science, if you have had a scientific background, if you have a science degree, there is a lot of opportunity, because all I hear is that there's a great gap, that there are not enough people. And I don't only mean women, but I think women in particular also would be singled out for having followed that and basically going into the field. It would be actually very, very beneficial if you were to study and have a scientific background and then go into this field, because there aren't enough people around. That's what I hear. That's what I hear from my colleagues at NTI. I don't know if others will see that. Like Filippa and Jamie. But on the other hand, that is something that is very beneficial. And it gives you a lot of opportunity, because you don't have to stay in that field. You go into some other ones. Let me add one other point, and I find this really important because, you touched upon, or we touched upon also in this field about AI. And I find that in a rapidly developing science, like bioscience and biotechnology, the norms always lag behind. The same I find is true for AI. What are we discussing a lot? We're discussing a lot about ethics, in AI. How is it applied? The same applies to biotechnology, bioscience. I think it was Filippa who mentioned the Lab 4, the laboratories, etc. How many are there? What are the standards that are being developed? And that's another field that I find very important that needs to be looked at. But you also need to understand the science in order to look at the norms that could be established. And it's very difficult because it does have the industry, it does have the governments, and basically many of these laboratories are not necessarily run by private industry, but they're also run by governments. So it's two strands basically in the field that you could go into.
Thank you, Angela. This is actually a very good point that makes me wonder. I did political science too. I studied political science, so I have no knowledge, but maybe James and Filippa, when had a different path. And I wonder, when you study STEM and biology or chemistry in high school or in at university, if these type of questions are raised during your studies, and I don't know if you have any knowledge of this, but if the security of biolabs is raised, and if the possibility of bioagents to be weaponized or used for malicious purposes is something that is looked at, because if not, that's definitely something that should be investigated. Maybe Filippa, I'll give the floor to you.
Thanks, Federica. Well, I don't know. Certainly, the security angles and bioweapons were not talked about when I was in high school, and there. I don't think there is much of that today either. I think but we do try to frame. There are initiatives to try to bring this onto the curriculum also at the high school level, but not in terms of you need to know what the BWC is and necessarily about the history of biological warfare, but really about you need to be considerate of wider society and where you're conducting your research, and how we consider what we consider responsible science to be today. And that means you do need to be conscious of how your science might be misused. So it's more about trying to get those principles introduced very early on. My own career was, I think, very traditional so far. I mean, I went straight from undergraduate to postgraduate, PhD, postdoc, now, lecturer, professor, and so on. So I've very much stayed within academia. My background is in both the natural and in the social sciences. So I have that mix of both perspectives. But what I've found is really that certainly it's helpful to have both a natural science and a social science background. But I think what's even more important is actually to be open to interdisciplinarity, to be open to approaching problems from multiple perspectives. So in all my research now, I work in multidisciplinary teams. I have, people with international relations backgrounds, but also people with biology backgrounds. I have lawyers on my teams. I have ethicists on my teams. What's important is being able to be open to understanding that there are different perspectives and different questions that are being asked of a topic, but also then to develop ways of communicating, because you will often come with very different assumptions depending on the field that you, depending on your background, different assumptions, different vocabularies. And so finding ways to actually cooperate in teams, I think, when it comes to questions like biology is incredibly important. So my recommendation would really be to, it would always first be follow your interests, right? Find something you're really excited about and follow that. But then the second one is really, well, regardless of what your discipline is, you will be able to fit in and you will be able to contribute, because something like biological weapons, biosecurity is such a big topic. We need all the help we can get from all different kinds of disciplines. So it's really more about working together and sharing, different perspectives and different approaches.
Thank you, Filippa. Jamie?
Thanks, Federica. Yeah, I think just in terms of the awareness in the curriculum, there have been several studies which have been done, I think, of several countries around the world that looked at the curricula to see what was there in terms of biosecurity, dual use, or that related content. And generally, the summary, from what I remember correctly, was really not very much at the moment. I do think that has changed. I think quietly bubbling away, under-remarked and underappreciated, there have been a number of initiatives led by champions from the community who have really tried to push things forward. I'm thinking here particularly of the work of University of Bradford, as well as the more high-profile initiatives. So Filippa mentioned the WHO, there's also the Tianjin Biosecurity Guidelines. So there have been these kind of pushes to try and raise awareness and identify specific steps that could be taken by different sets of actors, because it's not just those in education. I think it's those in industry, those funders, those publishers, and a range of different roles and responsibilities, which I think can feed into this. Just in terms of sort of changing tack slightly, in terms of my own background, I mean, I stumbled into this, I suppose, nearly 20 years ago. And I think what was particularly important for me is having mentors, first and foremost Malcolm Dando, who supervised my dissertation, but then subsequently a number of male and female mentors who have helped sort of steer me and then given opportunities, and that benefit immensely from the patience of others. I do think there's quite a small technocratic, but generally quite collegiate community within this field as well. I think that generally get on. I'd always agree that would be quite dull, but I think there's generally like a collegiate approach. So I think finding people who can help provide that support, mentorship, and open up doors, I think is really important. I'd also agree that interdisciplinarity is massively important. That might just be because I'm not a scientist and slightly insecure about this, but I do think that can be really valuable, because if you only know the science, or you only know history or law or politics, I think without engaging with other disciplines, it can really narrow down what you're able to do and how far you can actually understand some of these issues, because there are layers. And I think it's not just the law, it's the politics at the moment, which underpins the law, and the history that informs the politics. There's these connections which I think can only really be sort of unpacked by really having that interdisciplinary process. I'd also, two other things, I suppose. First of all, is if people do want to get involved, go talk to people. It's a fairly small community. Most people are amicable and accommodating. It is an accommodated community of practice. So go to talk to people, come to these sorts of events. I also find, and this is just a personal thing, but sort of taking notes at meetings and sort of sharing those notes forces you to concentrate and actually organize your own knowledge as well. And it's paid dividends sort of in the past for me. I think I'll stop there, but I'm happy to follow up as ever. Thanks.
Thanks so much, James. Thanks, Filippa, and thanks, Angela, for your answer and suggestions. I think it's time now to open the floor for our audience. I know already that there are a couple of questions in the chat. I'm not sure if you can also see them, but I would like to highlight a couple that I think are extremely interesting. They are related to the connection between the COVID pandemic. One of our attendee is asking whether the COVID pandemic has created a more favorable environment for negotiation and for the creation of a separate verification mechanism for the BWC. So I think this is tied a little bit to what Angela was talking about at the beginning. And then we have another question from an expert in disaster risk reduction, that would like to know whether there are any type of assessments or scenario based on risk assessment in place. So I think we can take these two questions as a start. Maybe once again we can go. We can follow the order that we've started with. So Angela, if you'd like to respond first.
Sorry, this was about the OPCW IEA. I was reading at the same time as you were speaking. Was that the question?
Yeah, so I tried to combine two questions because they look pretty similar to me. And I think the question was whether the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, worked as a stimulus to kickstart the creation of a separate verification mechanism, and then whether the pandemic has created a more favorable environment for negotiations.
Well, let me talk about the kickstart the verification discussion. And I think this is something that goes back, and I'm sure that Filippa and Jamie, who have been in this field a lot longer than I have, meaning in particular in the biological weapons convention field, can talk about, because verification is a very difficult subject. I mean, there were attempts made years and years ago, 20 years ago, and they were basically rebuffed. And they were rebuffed particularly by countries that had very large bioscience private industry, because there was always the feeling, or there was always the sense that this could open up trade secrets or anything that would then be shared and that would be misused by others. Has COVID made it more possible to discuss some of these issues? I think it has. I think it's just opened up the whole field, and it's put a spotlight on the field because of what happened with COVID. And that also put a spotlight to previous outbreaks, not necessarily, of course, of the scale of COVID, but on smaller outbreaks that we've had. So whether it's natural or whether it's, weapons related or whatever, but on the other hand, it's basically been good for us talking about these issues, because it's now become a lot more normal to talk about these, because normally beforehand people just didn't talk about that. That, I think, is very, very important. Whether it has led to additional diplomatic leeway in terms of getting agreement, I think it has not. And I think when you look at, for example, what was said about, you've had no final document. I think Filippa was the one who talked about that. You had no final document. You had very limited achievements, no article by article review of the Biological Weapons Convention 5-year review conference when it concluded. That's not a good development. Now, whether that would have happened without an invasion by Russia into the Ukraine, that's another question. Would it have opened it more? I tend to think on the positive side that it would have opened a lot more avenues to talk about this. But in view of the hick-hack between Russian Federation and other states, it simply wasn't possible to have anything that was more, how shall I say, conciliatory, or let's say constructive in terms of outcome. So to have an extra person, yes, that was a good outcome. But, there were other proposals that were put forward that did not find similar consensus. And that is always something that's very difficult. We've seen the same in terms of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, which took place in August last year. So we've seen the same difficulties arising there. It is not confined to the Biological Weapons Convention. But I find that it is really positive that we're talking about this now, that people are becoming more concerned about it, and that they're also looking at the interconnectivity. It's not only one issue, but there are so many other issues that play into this. And that is something that I find very beneficial, because people are becoming aware of it. And when it comes to, and let me just sort of say that also, when it comes to the specialization, going back to the previous topic, I wanted to sort of say that I teach at university at the graduate level, and I get a lot of young people coming to my office hours and so saying, how can we deal with this? And some of them are really thinking, is it good if I focus on just one field? Am I becoming a subject matter expert, and I can't leave that because I can't develop more capacity to kind of grow in my career? That's a very, very difficult question to answer. But I do think that if you start out as a subject matter expert and then gain other experience on top of that, whether it's in management or negotiation or whatever, I think that actually builds on it, because what you start out with is with a fact set. It's very, very hard. If you have the right grip on a topic and you can present the facts in a good way and in a convincing way, you've already won half the battle.
Thank you, Angela. This is definitely very good advice for young professionals entering the field. Filippa, would you like to step in?
Sure. I mean, it's really just to echo what Angela was saying. You would have thought that the COVID pandemic would have galvanized more initiatives within the BWC. But while we did see more attention externally, so by general public, for example, by the media, more sensitivity to the idea of the importance of biosecurity and the possibilities of harm, using biology for harm. And we did, of course, see some states referencing the pandemic and how, important an illustration it was to show how important the BWC also was in case, there would be a deliberately introduced pandemic. There was no new initiative on the basis of the pandemic. There was no new money, no new projects. And in fact, there was not even a mention of COVID-19 in the review conference final text, because that couldn't be agreed on. So while I think that the question is a very good one, you would think that this major event should be galvanizing things. within the BWC, it's so the positions are so entrenched, and the treaty is just being used to further different political agendas that it becomes very difficult to actually do something there. On the question of risk assessments, also a very good question. I think we do see a lot of risk assessment and scenarios and imaginaries, as you were asking about, when it comes to responding to biological events. Also, when it comes to investigating biological events, there are all kinds of tabletops and scenario-based risk assessments that go on. But there's another level as well, right? Which is at the lab level, when scientists are deciding which research projects and to carry out and how to do it. How do you assess for the safety and the security aspects of it? And there, I think we have less tangible scenarios, less tangible tabletop exercises of, well, how actually do you identify dual use? I mean, we're telling scientists you need to consider the possibility that your science is misused, but we have very few sort of good tools for them to do so, really, and few good examples. There are a few. I mean, Jamie was just referring to the one where using AI for drug discovery and the potential negative sides of that, where it could be, oh my goodness, here's a prime example of a technology that's intended for good, and at the end of it you have VX, or the molecular structure for VX. And so we do have some of those examples, but to actually these more work through scenarios, playbooks, narratives, wargaming, as it's often called today, we don't have at the laptop level, and I think that's a real gap. Thanks. Oh, and I should have said, Federica, Angela reminded me when she was talking about her role at university. If anyone is looking for a master's program in this area, I run a very good master's program in science and international security. So do look that up. We're open for business. We are very happy to take students we're accepting applications as we speak. And it's a really fantastic program, and we do really, really cool things. So I just wanted to plug that. So thank you for letting me do that. Over to you, Federica.
Thanks so much, Filippa. And just as a reminder, you are at King's College London. So if anyone is interested, please go and check the website. But James.
Yeah, thanks, Federica. I think one of the interesting things about COVID was that I think it did stimulate quite a lot of interest and attention. But I think publicly, a number of states are very cautious about pushing this too much within the context of the BWC, because it then gets very political, very difficult very quickly. I mean, some people did, and there was a big intake of breath, I think, at one point in the BWC when this was raised in quite a pointed fashion. I think a number were thinking about this, and it did lend momentum, but that was just done quite quietly. I think even looking in January and February, I think generally people were a lot more optimistic about what was possible and quite ambitious. And then you have Ukraine, and then the shutters come down. As Angela said, that's in the NPT, but also I think in the CD, Space OEWG, and bilateral arms control. Really, we've seen this sort of crumbling, real difficulties for these sorts of regimes, which is quite problematic. And in that context, I think the BWC Review Conference was quite a modest success. The other thing to keep in mind, I think, with verification issues was that there was a small, subtle but significant shift in US policy, I think, which from the first committee a couple of 2 years ago now, where I think there was more of an openness to actually at least begin to talk about this, to begin to use the V word, verification, again, because even prior to that, it was almost taboo in the BWC context. And then the other factor is that we have technological change, I think, which creates new opportunities for building confidence in compliance, if not verification. And as I think I mentioned before, but the last time we had multilateral sort of systematic discussion on science and technology was kind of 1992 and 1993, as part of the VAREX work. So much has changed over the last sort of intervening 30 years that I think there was almost an interest in perhaps looking again at what is possible in terms of detecting biological weapons programs. But as Filippa said, there's a sort of verification impasse with positions which are deeply entrenched around this and quite hard to shift, which I think makes it much more complicated to go back into this afresh in a manner that's constructive. I just suppose close on a note of sort of obligatory UNIDIR optimism. I think one thing, because of the circumstances and that sort of that verification impasse over sort of 20 years, I think the fact that they were able to achieve a mention of verification in the mandate potentially opens up some scope. There is potentially latent potential there for doing more in the future, for actually focusing NGO attention on verification issues and for giving space to actually have a discussion on that topic. So there's perhaps a ray of hope there in terms of what could be done through that mandate, which I think was otherwise quite frustrating, I think. Thanks.
Thank you, Jamie. I bet it's quite frustrating. But let's shift gears a little bit. And I have another question here that looks at non-state actors. So how do you assess the threat of non-state actors using biological weapons? How difficult it is for non-state actors to create biological or misuse biological agents? James, at the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned that there are barriers to weaponize biological weapons. We know that non-state actors are historically big fan of radiological dispersive devices. What are the chances of non-state actors also using biological weapons? And maybe we can go again in circle, Angela, and then Filippa, and then Jamie.
Thank you, Federica. It's a very interesting question and a very relevant one, particularly because I think it was Jamie who mentioned that it's so much more accessible right now to get information from public sources. The internet is there, free for all. You get a lot of information, and like he demonstrated also with the speech laboratory, that it's relatively easy to manufacture, lethal agents. Now, the difficulty with nuclear weapons is, of course, that in nuclear weapons you need certain materials, and those are very hard to get. So there's an obstacle. Let's say there's a higher hurdle to overcome than it is with biological agents. Now, there are various ways that the international community is dealing with that. I mean, the first of all is there was in 2004 there was a resolution adopted by the Security Council. It's called Resolution 1540, and that deals specifically with bad actors. That deals specifically with irregular groups or groups that want to get hold of a weapon, of whether it's nuclear, whether it's biological, whatever. And they look at a number of ways of how do you deal with that. I mean, they could look at financial transactions. There's an expert group that's working on this. They report to the Security Council. Some of their reports are available publicly. Other ones, I think, are declared more confidential because also of the sources that they use, and they're not accessible. But on the other hand, that's one way of dealing with it. Is it sufficiently resourced to do the work? I frankly doubt it. I mean, knowing from what I did when I was running the Office of the High Representative for Foreign Affairs. But on the other hand, it is one of the aspects. There's also an office that was created about 20 years ago in the UN that's called the Office for Counterterrorism. And they deal specifically also with weapons of mass destruction and also with biological weapons. They do a lot of training courses. And I will tell you that they are extremely well financed. And they have built up a whole system about how do you deal with this? How do you find out about it? What's happening there? And again, these are reports that are being made available to the member states, and then it's really up to them to deal with that. Because basically what it is under the Biological Weapons Convention, you as a government have also the obligation to prevent anyone from getting hold of biological weapons in your country. So there is an obligation on the member states, which makes it very pertinent to bring that information to member states or to the individual member state who might have a role in curbing it or going after the people people who might be developing something of a nefarious nature. So that's the two areas that I know are happening. But on the other hand, there are other players that are, outside of this area. I mean, I remember that you mentioned, I think, VX at one point. I think it was Jamie who mentioned the VX at one point. And you remember that there was an attack, a single attack on one person, and that was the half-brother of the DPRK ruler. So, that's basically, how do you go after that? I mean, you really didn't. But it's a very specific instance, because I think we're looking more in terms of larger scale attacks, which could harm a lot more people. So that is something that fortunately has practically, I don't want to say it's never happened, but it's happened extremely rarely.
Fortunately, I would say. Filippa.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, the idea that the pandemic could inspire copycatting is not outrageous. We saw, following the Amerithrax attacks that ensued very shortly after 9/11, inspired all kinds of copycat attacks, where so the Amerithrax attacks, of course, was anthrax sent in the post to media outlets and politicians, and that inspired lots of people to send flour, which is sent, in the post, which looks very much like it could also be anthrax. It followed with notes saying this is anthrax, and there were thousands of these hoaxes in the States, in the UK. There were also loads of these hoaxes, just copycatting. So yes, there is a concern that it could inspire some kind of non-state actor to turn to biological weapons. But at the same time, there is also a rather comforting history of non-use by terrorists when it comes to the biological field. So there's, just a handful of examples, and those are primarily failed examples to use biology as a terrorist, a tool of terrorists. And so a lot can also be learned from those few case studies we have. And that is, that there is a whole range of purposes to which you may turn to biology. And mass destruction is perhaps not one of those. When we talk about biological weapons in the framework of the BWC, the sorts of weapons that are often in people's minds are the biological weapons as they were conceived of in the 20th century, in the huge state programs of, for instance, the Soviet Union. And so these were, highly sophisticated biological weapons that would be attached to say, missiles, or spread as clouds over cities and affect large numbers of people. And so the concern with advances in science and technology is that we starting to know so much more about genes, their interactions between genotypes and phenotypes, and how bacteria and viruses enter bodies, how they spread, so that all of this new knowledge can be put together with some of those intentions and use around delivery mechanisms from the 20th century. But this is all very sophisticated stuff. And so we cannot be talking about, at the same time, hugely sophisticated advances in science and technology, all of the synthetic biology, the gene editing, modification, all of these things, and, a terrorist working out of his garden shed or his garage or kitchen sink or what have you. So I think we need to have a more nuanced perspective when it comes to terrorism. and the potential for bioterrorism, we do need to be conscious that this is a risk, but not one that, will start the next pandemic and kill the entire world. It's not existential. You may kill a small number of people. I mean, you could just infect yourself with Ebola and sit on the tube, for instance. That would be a very crude weapon, and you'd probably have some effect, but you wouldn't necessarily kill the whole world that way. And so I think it's important to have a more nuanced discussion about what the type of weapons we're linking with which kinds of actors. Over to you, Jamie.
Yeah, I should probably clarify. I'm not sure Dr. Lentzos is suggesting infecting yourself with Ebola, just to be very clear on that. But I think it's an important point, though, that ambiguity that sort of Filippa touched upon. I think it depends what you see a biological weapon as doing. I think there is scope for relatively crude, scruffy biological weapons. I think that is something that's relatively easy through stealing pathogens or deliberate spreading of diseases, or indeed hoaxes augmented by mis and disinformation. You could see that being relatively feasible. I do sort of share the point raised by Philip. I think weaponization is still going to be difficult. I think it's historically proven a barrier to bioterrorist programs. And I think it will continue to prove a barrier as well, because biology is capricious. I think if you want to have large-scale effects, then often that requires going through the aerosolization route, and that requires disseminating agents in a manner that is able to withstand environmental effects, which are really quite difficult to deal with in a way that's predictable and reliable. And more generally, I think that there are just far easier ways to cause terror, to cause mass destruction. So whilst we shouldn't ignore it, and I agree with Angela's point, it is potentially getting easier and more accessible. At the same time, I think it's important that it is treated in a nuanced way, because I think it can very easily get into sort of hype around bioterrorism. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jamie. We only have 3 minutes left, so I know there are a lot of questions in the chat that I wish we could go over, but I also don't want to take advantage of your precious time. So apologies to all the participants who have contributed with questions, but that we cannot address, unfortunately, this time. Big thanks to our speakers, Dr. Kane, Dr. Lentzos, Dr. Revill. It's been such a pleasure. I was delighted to spend my last hour and a half with you in your company, and I've learned so much, and I'm sure our participants have learned a lot too. So a virtual round of applause to you, and once again, thank you so much for your availability, and I look forward to staying in touch in the future. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Filippa. Bye-bye. Thank you, Ettore. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Many thanks again, all of you. Bye-bye.